The stare down. It is one of the most intense moments outside of the actual fight for the fighters, as this is an opportunity for the fighters to look their opponents in the eye to find that piece of weakness that can break their opponent and help psychologically give them the edge for the victory. It is the fight before the fight. MMA has been home to some amazing and intense stare downs over the years, but we are looking at the most intense and the best. This is the Fight franchise and the top 10 most intense stare downs in MMA history. Number 10. Conor McGregor vs Jose Aldo. The first entry on our list is one of the most famous fights in MMA history and is in fact half a stare down. Conor McGregor became a hugely popular star in MMA, whose rise to superstardom was meteoric. Due to Conor's massive rise in popularity, the UFC would hold promotion and worldwide press tour like never before, which had Conor pushing Aldo's buttons on multiple occasions, which had multiple face-offs. The one that makes the list, however, is the one right before the fight. Jose Aldo over the years had developed a strange habit before his fights, where he wouldn't look at his opponents in the eye before the bell rang. This meant when it came time to be face to face with Conor in the octagon, Jose couldn't look the man who tormented him for months in the eyes, while Conor stared at Aldo like he was prey and took a quick glance of him up and down and was about to eat Aldo as easy as breakfast. The fight lasted 13 seconds and was over, and the rest is history. People will question why does it make the list, as there was no stare down, but the fact Aldo couldn't look into the eyes of the man who was his bitter enemy, who insulted him and his country so much all that time, only for Conor to body Aldo in the manner he did, this was a lamb being fed to a lion, and is one of the most unique and intense stare downs in MMA history. Number 9. Diego Sanchez vs Clay Guida. MMA in the early days, especially the UFC, would have some wacky and wild personalities who were built and grew massively due to the wildly popular show of the time, The Ultimate Fighter. One of those fighters was Diego Sanchez, who over recent years has become a bit of a meme, but in the early days of MMA he was known for his intense nature and wild personality and fight style. Diego Sanchez would win The Ultimate Fighter and try and start a brilliant MMA career with mixed results. The UFC during Sanchez's career would sign Clay Guida, a wild man in his own right, with a crazy fun fight style which led the UFC to book them two in a main event of the TUF Season 9 finale. Sanchez and Guida had an epic clash and fight, which is now in the UFC Hall of Fame. But before the fight took place, they stared each other down with ferocious intensity, like they knew they were about to beat the crap out of each other and put on a Hall of Fame fight. What makes it brilliant is how they channel their intensity, where Sanchez is quite still and focused, while Guida is animated and moving side to side, which is similar to other stare downs that will feature on this list. But nonetheless, this intense stare down and the fight that came after helped earn this a well-deserved spot on the list. Number 8. Don Frye vs James Thompson. The epitome of the man's man on this list. Don Frye is your old school typical man. Frye was a pioneer of the early days of MMA and would compete in the tournament format and would win the UFC 8 tournament and become a legend of the early days in the UFC. This led him on a brilliant career which was 15-1 at one point, where Frye was competing for Pride in Japan and put on the fight of the year. Slowly as Frye was aging and MMA was evolving, he had mixed success in his MMA career. He would take on Englishman James Thompson, who was having mixed success in his own career, who was struggling to put together a string of wins. He took on Frye, who was much older but was a never back down SOB, where they squared off before the fight, getting in each other's face, pushing each other with their face, where they had one of the most intense face-offs in MMA history. Thompson would win the fight, beating the much older Frye, but this still to this day is one of the most intense stare downs, especially due to how competitive it was and the fact we rarely see stare downs like that in MMA anymore. Number 7. Rampage Jackson vs Marvin Eastman. Rampage Jackson is a legendary figure of MMA history, and if you ever saw his hilarious personality outside of the cage and how funny he was, you would be remiss to think he was one of the more intense and scary fighters of his era when it came to what took place in the octagon. Rampage had an incredible MMA career where he put on some legendary bouts and performances in Pride and the UFC. The UFC would acquire Pride and brought along their talent, which included Rampage, where he would become a star in the promotion. In his run in the UFC, he would face a ghost from his past in the form of Marvin Eastman, who was Rampage's first loss of his career. Eastman would return to the UFC after his failed first stint and make his debut for the second time against Rampage Jackson. The two squared off in the octagon and had an intense face-off, where both guys mimicked each other in the stare down and looked like they wanted to beat the crap out of each other. Rampage would win the fight and this grudge match via a brilliant KO, but the stare down before the fight is one of the best in MMA history. Number 6. Junior Dos Santos vs Cain Velasquez 3. One of the most legendary heavyweight trilogies in MMA history, Cain Cain Velasquez put on 3 epic title fights which featured many iconic and fun stare-downs and face-offs through their title fights, but the third fight in particular had the most intense and unique stare-down. When Cain Velasquez burst on the scene in MMA, he did it in epic fashion, securing some brilliant wins and stoppages, all the way to his eventual title win, destroying superstar at the time and champion Brock Lesnar. During the same time, Junior Dos Santos went on a brilliant win streak to earn a title shot where Dos Santos shocked the world and KO'd Velasquez in just over a minute. The rematch took place where this time Velasquez schooled Dos Santos and won via decision. It's the third fight in question which has the most iconic and intense stare down. Junior Dos Santos, a lot like Jose Aldo, has a thing he does before the fight, where he marches forward staring intensely at his opponent while pointing to the ground. He did this with Velasquez, who wasn't having any of it, where Cain walked up to him and looked him in the eyes as to say not today, and stared right back at Junior. This was followed by the pre-fight stare down, which was just as intense, with these two massive heavyweights intensely squaring off, which led to an iconic bout and win for Cain Velasquez. But these two face-offs before the fight were brilliant and unique, which helped earn it a spot on the list. Number 5. Chuck Liddell vs Vandana Silva. One of the huge pioneers in helping MMA become popular in the 2000s was Chuck Liddell, with his iconic look and super fun fight style. Chuck would make waves in the early days of MMA and become the face of the sport, and the UFC, where he was their light heavyweight champion. During his time in the UFC, he would have amazing success and become a great light heavyweight champion until he met Rampage Jackson and would lose his title via KO. During the same time, Vandana Silva would become one of the scariest fighters in Pride history, with his legendary fight style and intense nature. Pride would be purchased by the UFC and bought over Vandana Silva on a streak of 2 losses, where he would be making his UFC debut against Chuck Liddell, who was also on 2 losses. This fight felt like it was one we was getting a little too late, but we were still about to see the Axe Murderer versus the Iceman. They squared off in the cage where they had an intense stare down, with Vandana swaying back and forth while the emotionless Liddell followed his target Vandana until they separated. The fight was a war and was considered the fight of the year. To give us the fight of the year and such a legendary stare down earns it a well-deserved spot on the list. Number 4. Don Frye vs Ken Shamrock. That's right, Don Frye, being the man's man and an absolute intense character, actually had 2 very legendary and intense stare downs in MMA history. The first one we saw earlier on the list was an older and past his prime Frye taking on James Thompson, but he still had an amazing and intense stare down. This time he was taking on a pioneer of the sport and one who helped it grow from the beginning. After quite the career in Pancrase and the UFC, Ken Shamrock decided to take his skills to Pride, where after mixed success there, he would eventually take on Don Frye. They squared off in the ring, and what preceded was arguably the most macho stare down in MMA history. They faced off where both guys were eerily still and never broke eye contact and never blinked. To be honest, of every stare down on this list, this is the closest you're gonna get to a 50-50 stare down. The expressionless nature of it and the way they look at each other like they want to kill each other, this is easily one of the most intense and best stare downs ever. Number 3. Alex Pereira vs Yuri Praska. A recent entry, but nonetheless a fun and iconic entry, Yuri Praska would join the UFC and in 3 fights become the undisputed light heavyweight champion. A division below, kickboxer Alex Pereira started in MMA on a mission to prove wrong at the time world champion Israel Adesanya. Pereira climbed the middleweight ladder all the way to a title shot where he would TKO Izzy in the 5th round to become world champion. After this happened, Yuri had to relinquish his title due to an injury, where the division became a mess. All the while, Alex Pereira suffered a devastating loss at the hands of Israel Adesanya. This prompted Alex Pereira to move up to light heavyweight and try and capture a second belt, where he would beat Jan Blachowicz. This earned him a title shot for vacant gold against the returning Yuri Prohaska, which was a dream matchup, which had fans hyped, selling it as the Amazonian warrior taking on the Czech samurai. The stoic Alex Pereira, once in the cage, stood eerily still, staring right at the ultra calm Yuri Prohaska. They did this through the entire Bruce Buffer intro, which was unreal, and set the mood and the backdrop for a super intense showdown which Pereira secured the finish in. It won't surprise me if Pereira in the future happens to make another entry on this list. Number 2. Rory McDonald vs Robbie Lawler. One of the greatest MMA fights of all time and one of the most violent fights of all time was privy to one of the best stare downs in MMA history and also one of the most unique. Robbie Lawler got started in MMA in the early 2000s and would compete in the UFC and around the world until he made his way back into the UFC, while Rory McDonald, once he made his way out of the regional scene in Canada, would join the UFC in 2010. The two men crossed paths in 2013 in a 3-round fight at UFC 167, where Robbie would climb the welterweight rankings and secure the title, while Rory, after his loss to Robbie the first time, would would secure 3 wins and then earn a title shot. Both men were intense but respectful before the fight, and even in the pre-fight stare down in the cage. It's the stare down, however, in the 4th round of this fight which actually makes this list. After having a war across the 3rd and 4th round, both men were bloody and battered in the cage, and the horn rang for the end of the 4th. With both men exhausted and tired and with 1 minute to rest and recover, instead of going immediately back to their stools, they spent seconds staring at each other intensely, covered in blood, with neither man wanting to back down. It was like they were trying to find the breaking point in each other's soul. The stare down saw Robbie Lawler walking towards a backing up Rory McDonald, which was an indicator of the fight outcome, with Robbie finishing Rory in the 5th. It's one of the best and most iconic images in MMA history and easily gets a spot on the list. Number 1. Miraco Crocop vs Vandana Silva. You all knew it was going to be number 1, as it has been quoted by Joe Rogan as the greatest stare down of all time, and to be honest, I and many others totally agree. Vandana Silva made an earlier entry on this list, and it was easy to see why then, but he was one of the scariest fighters in Pride history with his vicious fight style. Going into this first bout with Crocop, he was on a 6-fight win streak, with his last 5 wins coming via stoppage. He was taking on a K1 kickboxer who decided to move over to MMA and compete in Pride. Miraco Crocop was known for his devastating fight style and his vicious head kicks. They squared off in a special rules bout at Pride 20, where they faced off in a now legendary stare down. Vandana Silva was swaying back and forth as he usually does, with an intense look in his eyes, while the unwavered Miraco Crocop, who was nowhere near as animated, matched his energy with a calm, stone cold demeanor, who is not going to be bullied or back down. I think the best summation of this stare down ever was Vandana Silva is looking like he wants to kill Crocop, while Crocop is deciding where to bury Silva's body. The same objective, but 2 totally different mindsets and levels of intensity to this stare down, which is why it earns the legendary number 1 spot on this list. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. What do you think is the greatest stare down in MMA history? Put that down in the comments below. And what is your top 10 stare downs in MMA history? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.